Hi everyone, this is Nikki from the Refugee Education Centre, and this is the cultural competency part of our volunteer training. So in this training, we are going to look at the different communities that the Refugee Education Centre serves, and some advice and some tips on how best to communicate with those individuals and how to walk alongside them as you begin volunteering with us. So first of all, we are going to think about culture because it is a word and an idea that has so much attached to it. So we're going to break it down a little bit. So I would like you to think of someone else's culture as a mountain and as yourself as a mountaineer at the bottom of that mountain. So at the bottom of that mountain, perhaps you're still interacting with someone else's culture and community, and maybe you're doing that through something like eating food that comes from another culture. So perhaps you're eating in a restaurant that is South American or African or Asian. And when you're doing that, you're seeing individuals perhaps speaking different languages or dressing differently. But we're still interacting with that other culture on a little bit of a surface level. As you begin volunteering with the Refugee Education Centre, we'll be moving up that mountain and starting to interact with individuals on a little bit of a deeper level. So thinking about things like communication style or the values that those communities hold. So for an example, I am from Scotland, as you may be able to tell from my accent, and I come from a culture that is quite averse to physical affection. But as I began working with the Refugee Education Centre, I began working with communities where physical affection is part of greeting. So on my first day, I worked with a Congolese family where as soon as I entered the home, the father of the family wrapped me in a bear hug as a form of greeting. And I was incredibly uncomfortable because our two cultures were clashing. Mine saying that physical affection isn't really something we do, and they're saying that physical affection is important part of greeting. So you're going to see things like that as you begin working with us as a volunteer. You're going to start to see things about communication style and adapting your behavior, like I've had to adapt mine to make sure that we're walking alongside our families. So now that we have an idea of how we're looking at culture, we're going to break that down again into two separate ideas. So we're going to have a look at value orientation first, and then communication style second. So for value orientation, we are going to compare the dominant culture on value orientation of the United States, which is individualism, with a value orientation that is strong with many of the communities we serve, which is collectivism. So if you look at the picture on your screen, the individual at the front is Nathaniel, my predecessor, who is from the United States and whose dominant value orientation is individualism. So that means very much pull yourself up by your bootstraps, focus on which school you go to, maybe the car you drive, the home you live in, the job you do, focus on your individual worth. And that also comes with something we call high power distance. So looking at the individuals around you and comparing your situation and your status in terms of power to those individuals to see where you fall. A lot of the communities we serve fall into a very different value orientation group, which is collectivism. So the other individuals in the picture you're looking at are the Adam family from Sudan, and they are very much from a collectivist society. So that is about pooling individual resources, pooling skills and knowledge for an overall collective goal. So if you think about agricultural societies, which have a collective goal of a harvest or maintaining agricultural success, there is a collective goal and lots of different skills that individuals have and come together to make that happen. And that is what collectivism is. So you can see that there is quite a lot of room for conflict between those different value orientations as individuals arrive. So something we see quite often with our students is individuals from collectivist societies. Occasionally teachers or school staff will contact our staff with concerns about cheating. And what that comes from is often an individual getting up in a test situation and helping their neighbor who is struggling with something they understand. What they're doing is what their value orientation tells them to do. They're using their collective knowledge to help each other. But what individualism tells us in this culture, focus on test and how you do in that test and high power distance, where you fall in your class, is that we can't do that. And our role is to make sure that schools understand the cultural piece and families understand what has to be done here. But you may also see that as you begin working with students, you may see that some of our students prefer to work in groups, or that some students are particularly keen to help each other, and sometimes that comes from that value orientation. There's also some ability for conflict for parents. So obviously if you are coming from a culture where a group helped each other out with difficulties or with goals, coming into a situation where the expectation is that each individual supports their family alone and completes a lot of different things alone, that can be quite stressful. A lot of new stress for a parent. Additionally, there are some other challenges that come with this different value orientation, and that is from our families experiencing individualism. And what that challenge is called ethnocentrism. Now, ethnocentrism, it means looking at someone else's experience through the eyes of your own. So expecting someone to have a similar experience to you, and therefore judging their experience based on your own. It can be a little bit tricky. So what that can lead to with our families is perhaps we are looking at the situation of our refugees as they arrive, and they are often language learners. So they're beginning off in jobs where full language fluency in English isn't needed. So often they're working in factory jobs, which may be a little bit lower paid. They're using public transportation because they don't have a driver's license yet. And their students are attending schools where they can receive the English language support that they need to become successful. That extra support that some other schools may not provide. All of that is absolutely fine, but what that can lead to is us looking at our experience of perhaps owning a car and not riding public transportation, or going to a different school, can see that individuals judge our families or our clients based on their own experience. And that can lead to things like people saying, you know, you shouldn't ride on the bus is dangerous. That can be a very difficult thing if that is based on an incorrect perception of someone because they haven't had to ride the bus, but also because our families have a very different idea of danger and what that means. And we've had these situations in the past, and it has led to situations like our family saying, you know, I don't want my children to ride the bus because I've been told it's dangerous. So all of this is really coming to say, be careful as you're working with our families on just making sure that any concerns you have are coming from a place of a legitimate concern, and perhaps just checking that it isn't your own experience clouding the view of the experience of these families. And if you do have concerns, of course, you can always approach rec staff and we will always talk through that with you. But it's important to think about where our own cultural assumptions come from and where our own cultural experiences might affect the families that we're serving and working with. So that's really it for our value orientation. And I know this is fast, but moving on, we're going to also look at how our families differ in communication style and how to communicate with them. So we're going to look at that in the lens of high context communication and low context communication, which is an idea which was created by an individual called Edward Hall. And there are some references at the end of this video. So Edward Hall worked in the 1950s and 60s, and he was interested in body language. And he traveled the world looking at how individuals in different communities use body language to communicate. And through that, he wrote a book called The Silent Language, which is interesting if you're intrigued to read it. It's a little bit old-fashioned, but if you're interested, take a look. And what he did with that information is he created a scale of high context to low context communities. High context are communities where body language is very important for communication, where there is less direct communication verbally and a lot of looking at body language and determining what that means first. So the highest context country in the world is Japan. Low context is very much the United States and Europe, where we're looking at comfort with direct communication, so verbally just asking for what we need, talking through things, and less focus on body language. So what that can lead to is also some difficulty. So if we think about a high context community that we serve, is the Burmese community. They're very high context, so there's a lot of focus on body language, on cultural practices. For example, removing your shoes before you enter a home is a respect practice. In conflict with the United States, which is low context. So when families come in to this culture and this communication style, they're expected to be able to verbalize what they need right away and be very comfortable with someone verbalizing their needs at them. And that can be quite an uncomfortable situation and quite stressful. It can also lead to things like when you are tutoring an individual or when a student is in school, some discomfort if you're from a high context country with being called upon individually, because individual immediate communication can be a little bit stressful, and those students might be more comfortable with group work if they're becoming a little bit stressed. So communication styles differ greatly across the families that we serve. As I had said, the Burmese families and Burmese community are quite high context, whereas our Congolese families are very low context and very much match the communication style of the United States, the ability and want to communicate verbally very clearly what your wants are. So outside in difference of communication styles, there are some other barriers to communication that exist as we work with our refugee communities. One of the big ones that's highlighted on this image on your screen is stress. So obviously our families are refugees. They have fled a country. They have spent some time in a refugee camp, and now they've arrived in the United States. Sometimes when our families arrive in the United States, it perhaps is the first time in quite some time that they have had the room to think about what they've been through. So they have the stability of their home, the safety of being in a place that is no longer in conflict. So they have some room to think about what has led them to be now in the United States. What that can lead to, obviously, is thinking through some past trauma, which can lead to families wanting to isolate themselves or feeling the need to isolate themselves because they're going through that traumatic experience again. So if you are working with a family and you're working with students and you see or you have concerns that there might be some isolation going on, some mental health concerns, absolutely share it with any staff member, and we would be happy to work with that family and refer them for some mental health support if that ends up being needed. Since we've touched on trauma, we'll talk about it just a little bit more in depth. So obviously our families have gone through different levels of trauma. So for the first one, they are refugees, so they've had to flee their home country for whatever reason, from perhaps a conflict or being part of a group that is targeted, and that is a huge loss and hugely traumatic. But then fleeing and having to then live in a different country, cross a border and live in a second country, perhaps in a camp, then there may be poor living conditions, there may be a lack of structure in the day, there may be a lot of transitional living, the living conditions may not be so great, and so that comes with its own trauma living there. And many of the families we work with have lived in refugee camps or transitional housing situations for many years. But then once they arrive in the United States, there is further level of trauma. So you're in a new home and that comes with stability and safety, and that's wonderful. But there is, like we've talked about, the culture shock of different communication styles, of different values held by this community, and perhaps of family separation if family members have had to be left behind in the refugee camp. So there is a great deal of trauma that comes with acclimatizing to a new home that our families are going through. And so it's really important, if you have concerns for the students who work with you, let us know so that we can make sure they're getting the support they need. And Grand Rapids does have a number of support systems specifically for this need. So this is a video that I'm not going to play for you, but I'd like you to take a look at. It is not exactly what we've been talking about, but it is a little bit of an easy way to see what can happen when we aren't able to communicate with each other, and some ways to alleviate that, some creative ways to come up when perhaps someone isn't able to communicate with you. What we're going to talk about next is how we work and how we make sure that we're communicating clearly with individuals and overcoming language and cultural difference as a barrier to that communication. So this is called the Competency Model, and it arose from the Cultural Intelligence Centre in Lansing, which really continued the work of Edward Hall, the individual who came up with the high context and low context scale. So there are 4 steps to the competency model, and we're going to work through each one. And this is really how you are going to work with these individuals as you begin volunteering. So the first step is your motivation. So you already have this. You have already shown interest in volunteering with the Refugee Education Centre and welcoming your newest neighbours and walking alongside them as they acclimatise to their new community and become successful individuals. So you already have the motivation. You've already reached out, which is wonderful. The next piece is a cultural understanding. So taking what you learn here, taking things like knowing that perhaps some individuals are going to expect a physically affectionate greeting when you work with them in person, or knowing that some individuals are uncomfortable with being called on because of the cultural piece of being from a high context country. Those pieces, you're going to take your cultural understanding and you're going to use that to make sure that you're walking alongside these students in the best possible way and that you're trying your best to communicate in a way that works. You're going to use that knowledge to plan your interaction. So perhaps you know that when your student comes through the door, you're going to expect a hug and you're going to be ready to give that, the way I now am with my Congolese clients when I work with them. I'm ready to be physically affectionate, even though it might not be a part of my own culture. So we're going to plan our interactions to make sure that we're making everyone comfortable and we're working with them in the best possible way. And then we're going to put that plan into action. So we're going to make sure that we are thinking about communication styles, that we're thinking about values, and we're modifying our behavior to fit that. So if you think about it in terms of a very simple equation, your motivation and your cultural knowledge is going to make sure that you're able to communicate with these individuals. So a very simple 4-step system for making sure you communicate, but it is the best possible way and the way that makes sure that we are doing our best to walk alongside these students. So if you have any questions about this, I know it was very, very fast. So if you have any questions, any concerns, or anything that you'd like to talk about in more depth, feel free to email me at this email address. Also, here are the references for this video. So if you want any more information, feel free to check those out. And with that, we are going to call it a day. So thank you so much. Bye.